Good evening, everyone. My intent is to talk for about 15-20 minutes and then take any questions that you have on any topic. So thank you, Suzanne. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It is an honor for me to join all of you here inside the beautiful Cloister Ballroom at Sea Island Resort as part of the annual Cipher Brief Threat Conference. I'd like to start by thanking the senior team at the Cipher Brief, including both Suzanne and Brad. I look around the room and I see a number of my distinguished colleagues who I've had the distinct pleasure of serving with over the years. It's great to see you all again. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, for prioritizing partnership and the great things we can accomplish together in the face of our nation's leading strategic challenges. We live in a world growing in complexity, where conflict is no longer bound by direct combatants alone, where new technologies are changing the nature of warfighting, and third parties shape the environment of conflict and the art of the possible. Tomorrow marks the one-year anniversary of the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel. One need not look beyond the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine to appreciate the dangers we face across the globe. These conflicts are playing out against a backdrop of a larger contention for global leadership, in which the West faces an unprecedented challenge from the PRC in a struggle for our global future. China is growing in power and its aggressiveness in seeking to upend the world order that has fostered economic growth, freedom, and stability since the Second World War. Make no mistake about it, China and the West hold dramatically different worldviews and play by different rules. The PRC prioritizes its own security and ambitions over the freedom and self-determination of peoples across the globe. The PRC represents the generational challenge of our time, operating both as an urgent military threat in the Indo-Pacific region and as an enduring competitor across all elements of national power, as it strives to supplant the democratic ideals of the United States and undermine international order. The scope and sophistication at which the PRC continues to grow its capabilities and extend its global reach is matched only by the sheer scale and speed at which it acts. It's a reality that it has intensified their actions in cyberspace, where the PRC represents the most daunting of our threats. China has the world's largest cyberspace operations workforce, engaged every day in a deliberate campaign to steal our technology and target our national security systems and the defense industrial base. The PRC produces and drives cutting-edge technologies, including AI, while Chinese state-sponsored hacker groups aim to compromise our vital infrastructure. It's a combined arms approach, along with their actions in other domains, that generates intel collection, spurs research and development, and pre-positions the PRC to launch future cyber attacks. Despite the threat that it poses, the PRC also faces some important weaknesses in its competition with the United States. The PRC military, for all of its expanding capabilities, still lags behind the U.S. military by many qualitative measures and lacks recent real-world combat experience as a joint force. Whether PRC commanders can effectively orchestrate their own growing arsenal in a major conflict remains an untested question. The PRC also now faces significant economic vulnerabilities. After decades of fast-paced economic ascent, the PRC is now grappling with slower growth, a declining labor pool, and efforts by foreign trade partners to reduce their dependencies on PRC supply. Economic constraints will pose more difficult choices for PRC leadership as they have to balance domestic stability and global ambitions. Addressing these challenges will require innovative thinking by PRC leaders. However, the China Communist Party's tighter authoritarian grip could very well stifle the agility of the PRC and the will to navigate its most pressing challenges. In our openness to diverse perspectives and the resilience of our democratic model, and in our robust network of close alliances and partnerships, our nation retains some significant advantages that the PRC does not enjoy. While we may not be able to match the quantitative superiority of the PRC, we must sustain a qualitative edge. That is our strategic advantage, and it can best be accomplished through partnership and innovation. This is my ask for all of you. It will take actions on the part of our entire country, government, industry, and academia all moving as one to respond to the sweeping approach being carried out by PRC cyber actors. In order to keep our country safe, we need to transform the manner in which the DoD and IC partners with the private sector. The whole-of-nation efforts in cyberspace by the PRC demands a whole-of-nation response by the United States. Through unity of effort and unity of action, we will bring together the totality of our authorities, resources, capabilities, and talent to outpace the PRC's action in cyberspace and attain and sustain friendly freedom of maneuver. We all know the PRC is content with playing the long game. We've been saying that for years. We are living it now. While we as a nation possess the technology and talent to match the PRC's current pace of play, we must continue to develop and hone our own tactical blueprint. This will better position our nation and allies toward countering the future cyber intentions of our most prominent global competitor. While we strive to improve every day, we must minimize the gaps that exist between the many different federal government entities and close the seams that currently stand between industry and the government. For us to effectively meet the challenges in cyberspace posed by the PRC, we must redefine our private-public partnerships. It's more than just information sharing. We need to learn from each other, work closer with one another, evolve together, and at the end of the day, deliver outcomes together. In my role as a combatant commander in charge of U.S. Cyber Command and as the director of the National Security Agency, I have the privilege of seeing every day the successes that result from close collaboration. The unparalleled partnership between the command and agency is one built to defend the interests of the United States and our allies, particularly in cyberspace. By leaning on the unique attributes of the personnel within Cyber Command and NSA, we will solve our toughest problems with a foundational focus on the law and the understanding of our authorities that align with our highest priorities. Through this lens, we will continue to gain intelligence concerning PRC plans and intentions. We set ourselves apart by ensuring we share that information with relevant stakeholders and mission partners in both a timely and actionable manner. By disclosing the actions of our adversaries, often in unclassified settings, we motivate and empower governments worldwide to take more action against malicious cyber activity. Together, U.S. Cyber Command and NSA react to the actions of the PRC by developing and coordinating response options within their respective authorities. Our approach to the PRC allows for the command and agency to provide exceptional SIGINT and cybersecurity support to policymakers and warfighters in a way that enables the U.S. to continue to outmaneuver the PRC. Through integrated planning, Cyber Command and NSA maximize operational outcomes by layering cyberspace and information activities in tandem with other government actions. From a command perspective, we will continue to serve as a technology fire starter for the Department of Defense. We will generate rapid innovation and promote technology sharing to offset the advantage in numbers possessed by the PRC. Through cooperative research and development agreements with a variety of partners, we can better collaborate to develop and apply technology to meet operational requirements, both increasing interoperability and the tempo at which we work. We can also use these research and development agreements to form a public-private partnership with the defense industrial base to create new cyber tactics, techniques, and procedures. For the last 4 years, NSA's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center has countered the PRC cyber campaigns with both information and intelligence. We will continue to build new relationships across the defense industrial base and expand existing ones in an effort to secure the DIB from intellectual property theft while preventing our critical networks from being used to target DoD and other networks. Truly, the cyber domain is created by industry, and it's industry who will most directly impact our collective ability to defend U.S. interests and those of our allies. The value we place on freedom of thought allows us to innovate and partner quickly, contradicting the PRC's mindset of centralized control. This broad partnership towards a shared purpose is a principal way we can contest the PRC during competition and in critical preparation for a potential crisis. The relationships we are building today allow us to achieve agility, scale, and capabilities that would not otherwise be available to us. It's the competitive advantage our nation has over the PRC. It's the power of collaboration. Thank you. Welcome your questions.
You guys gonna make me ask questions? If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. We have people. Yep, here we go.
Good evening. What strategy is Cyber Command implementing to enhance our defensive capabilities against Chinese cyber operations while collaborating with allied authorities to ensure a unified response?
So that is, of course, one of our principal responsibilities. So U.S. Cyber Command, we have 3 missions. We defend the Department of Defense information networks. We defend the nation in cyberspace, which really means a focus on adversary cyber or the other nation's hackers. And then we develop capabilities and planning in support of the joint force, all of the other combatant commanders. So central to that is what does the Department of Defense need to be positioned to be able to conduct operations without any external interference, and also to posture to integrate cyberspace operations as part of an all-domain series of activities executed by the Department of Defense. So for us, we start almost every planning effort with the same construct. So if we're thinking about a challenge that could be presented by another nation's cyber force, first thing we want to do is generate insights. How does U.S. Cyber Command, in close collaboration with the National Security Agency, understand threats? Because that becomes the foundation. How do we prioritize our defensive activities in a way that is aligned against the most likely threats? And then who are the partners that will help enable defense? Our second focus is always enabling defense. And in there, that's a collaboration with our foreign partners, with those that we work with every day. When you think about the activities that are going on around the world, the combatant commanders that we work with, EUCOM, as they work to support Ukraine, is managing a coalition throughout Europe. We want to make sure we can both defend that, but also enable it through secure communications. Last thing is really about then how do we operate together and how do we impose costs? One of the principal ways that we impose costs on the PRC starts with our ability to expose their activities. So if you go back to May 2023, when we began a discussion across the US government with the American population and disclosing what Volt Typhoon actors were doing, which are the PRC group that was targeting the critical infrastructure of the United States and other nations, it started with an exposure of their activities. And that, we believe, is the catalyst for collaboration. If we can expose what an adversary is doing at an unclassified level, that means we have no barriers between us when we're talking with industry, when we're talking with our foreign partners, or we're talking across the Department of Defense. We can have that conversation very quickly, understand how the adversary is operating, what tools they're using, what their priorities are. We have put that out in great detail at the unclassified level and published it on NSA's websites with public advisories, with CISA, with FBI, with foreign partners, and with industry. That's the catalyst for collaboration. Being able to get as much information available that allow us to bring us strengths, not just within the department, but within our interagency and within our foreign partners, and then most importantly, with industry.
Sir, thank you very much for your presentation. General David Petraeus and General Doug Lute talked earlier about some of the profound lessons of the war in Ukraine, in particular for the U.S., in particular exposing some of the weaknesses of our traditional defense industrial base and some of the profound, and the implications of needing to have a more iterative, fast innovation cycle for new weapon systems and employment of them. Are you seeing any kind of similar lessons coming from war in Ukraine on the cyber side?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think what we saw at the outset, there were a number of things. One is this idea of public disclosure. So the what the administration did to be able to declassify information to ensure that the world understood what was happening was a foundational start point for then who needed to collaborate. And in the case of cyberspace, I think one of the really core lessons is around resilience. And when we think about what does it look like to be under duress as a nation, the choices that Ukraine made right before the conflict were just essential for them to be able to continue government function. Because some of the attacks that Russia did, whether it was the large-scale Visa attack or their efforts to be able to do specific wiper attacks that would have taken out some of the Ukrainian government infrastructure, were all largely less impactful because of the resiliency work that Ukraine had did with Western cloud providers. And the ability that going into that conflict, they had had a law at that moment that said they needed to keep Ukrainian data, government data, internal to Ukraine. They changed the law right before the conflict, which allowed them to also offshore their data in cloud providers. That resilience allowed them to sustain early effects and continue to operate. So I think that's a core thing. The second area that I think is a really something that we had to take away as well, what does it look like in terms of the secure communications between European Command, other NATO allies, and Ukraine, so that Western nations could share intelligence securely with Ukraine? And so when we think about what does that mean for future conflict, and ensuring that now we will likely be in environments where all communications are going to be contested, how do we ensure both resilience and the ability to share information and do that securely regardless of the threat you're under and in a very changing dynamic environment? So I think those are the first two things that we saw. The other areas are clearly what did it look like from a perspective of multiple non-aligned groups attacking Russia. And what became of suddenly a whole bunch of other actors joined the battlefield is an area that I don't know that we had really put a lot of thought into for this environment, that it was going to manifest in that way. And so I think how we think about, we've got to think about that and consider it as we think about what additional conflicts would look like. But in those cases, I think right at the outset, the resiliency is probably the biggest component that, from my perspective in the job as U.S. Cyber Command, that I need to think about to be able to give good advice to the Secretary. And then for each of our combatant commanders, we want to ensure they have secure communications to be able to interrupt with the coalition that will be built around any crisis.
Congratulations, General, for your appointment. I'm excited that you're here. My name is Kelly Bissell with Microsoft. Also love that you said you want to redefine the public partnership and co-innovate. So if you had your magic wand and you could have Microsoft do whatever you wanted, what would that be?
So I won't make it specific to Microsoft.
All right, good. Thank you.
But what would it look like? So today, I think we've come a long way. I think there's no doubt that we have come a long way. In terms of how we communicate, at what level we're able to communicate, both at an unclassified level and at classified, and there's information sharing that does go on at a really good scale. But what would it look like if we campaigned together? And that we were working together and really having an honest conversation about what the threats not only do we see today, but where our adversaries giving us the clear signals of where they want to go. And then be able to have a conversation about how do we collectively defend. And have that in a way that would allow industry members to collaborate in ways that would make us more collectively defending the interest of the United States. I think there's some opportunities for us, and I think it's what we found in our experience in the Cyberspace Collaboration Center, is having a venue that isn't built on compliance, it's not built on law, it's not built on regulation, it's built on collaboration. And how do we as a US government, not just NSA, because I think we've got great teammates in FBI and CISA. And then you start to go out to all the other agencies, whether that's Department of Energy. We have really good teammates that are working this with individual industry segments. How do we bring that together for a more unified approach in information sharing and then collective action that would make it harder on a PRC or a Russia to be able to produce an outcome? And then if we sat down and did that, what are the barriers that are in our way? And I think in many cases, those barriers are ones that we've either put up over time inside the US government that we're working our way through and knocking down, but many of those exist in how industry talks to each other. And that's an area I think that we can play some common denominator in communicating what threat looks like and then encouraging that unified action.
General, thank you very much for being here. You've been talking about America's great strengths, right? The ability to collaborate, to innovate across government and industry. I'm curious what your assessment is of China's strengths in this domain and what we need to do to be mitigating or neutralizing those strengths so that the battle space plays to America's advantages rather than to China's.
So I think there's a couple areas in there that we can really look at. I think all of us have clearly seen where China would like to go on standards, and clearly trying to advantage particular subsets of industry and technologies that have largely been technologies that have been stolen from the United States and repurposed and now redone inside of their environment. So that's certainly not in our interest in any way. So I think from a standards perspective, that could be one part of our discussion. But they have seen our playbook about what it looks like to create open standards and are certainly trying to leverage that. So I think that's an area for them that we have to look at. The second area is they have clearly invested in technologies that enable control, whether that be facial identification, the Great Firewall, whether that be the ability to monitor all of their civilians in ways that we would, of course, never consider. That is exportable. Like, there are nations that want that technology. And that's certainly not in our own interests and how we approach it. But because they have that desire for personal information from that perspective of control, then we should also have to be very aware of what are those implications of how we interact with China, both as nations and as individual citizens. And thinking about what those consequences are of the use of our data. The discussion that has occurred on TikTok is, of course, one example of that. But there are other exemplars of where we are making our data as individual citizens very available to China in a routine way. Those are things I think we should be considering as it's clearly an area that they have put their resources, and we should understand the consequences of that. I think the other thing that we, of course, observe is a strength is scale. So they are bringing scale to these problems, and that's why we have to be able to leverage the partnerships to be able to counter that. We have to be able to grow all of the teammates that are on the right and left of trying to defend against whatever activity that they are trying to do that is malicious. We should be jointly defending that. Now, the other part of it is, we know that there will, of course, be strong commercial relationships between every one of our partners, the United States and the PRC. And how do we inform that from a perspective of technology theft? And which technologies China wants? And which ones they're trying to subvert from a Western perspective? And that's part of what my role is in the National Security Agency, is to be able to identify those threats, communicate those to our nation's leaders, and then collaborate with other nations to ensure that we understand what those goals and desires are. So I think inside their strengths still come back to a foundational, just that foundational core difference of what we see the world looking like and what the PRC sees their desire for the world.
Good evening, General. Scott Cooper, I'm at Peraton. I've got a question, if you can just take us back a little bit on your own perspective. If my memory serves, your first assignment, operational assignment, was in Misawa, Japan. How did you look at China back then, and how has your opinion and thoughts about China just matured, developed over the years? Second part of the question, your dad was a enlisted Marine Corps navigator. Do you have any regrets not joining the Marine Corps?
So what I always described about I'll talk about my dad. My dad was very proud of the fact that not only was he an enlisted navigator in the Marine Corps, he was the first married enlisted navigator in the Marine Corps. And the only reason he was allowed to, at that time, the Marines did not allow you to be an enlisted navigator and be married. My dad was so stubborn that he finally broke the Marine Corps to allow him to go to that training. So he was incredibly proud of that. But what my dad did not instill, I certainly learned the Marine Corps hymn very early in my life, he instilled the idea of service. And so that's what I picked up versus the Marine Corps. So when I'll give you first my bias. So when I was in Misawa Air Base, Japan in 1992 to 1995, it was at that time one of our largest Air Force intelligence facilities. At that moment, I was a Russian studies major. So I was 2 years off from having just lived in the Soviet Union, completing a semester in Leningrad State University, and arrived at Misawa with a priority of being focused on Russia. And so I did come at this at that point that our vast priorities, even then, were really almost exclusively Russia, small consideration for China. And so I think all of us at that moment were still very tied to that Russia-centric viewpoint of the world. And then as we have now gone through the last few decades, there are points in there that you can begin to see, particularly from an airman's perspective, where their investments in technology were starting to make us think, okay, now when we're talking about replicating things on ranges, increasingly we now needed to be thinking about Chinese technology. Not exclusively, but that started to become part of our discussion. From a cyber perspective, when we go back 15 years, we had a foundational set of assumptions about PRC cyber. And now we've watched that evolve rapidly over the last decade into a force that has certainly been investing and leveraging a whole-of-nation approach to making their cyber forces better. And so I think it's been an evolution and watching the change in how they prioritize, how they've invested. And one of the things that I see today, when we talk about their whole-of-nation effort, is how China approaches vulnerabilities versus how we approach it. So they now have a law that if any company in the PRC finds a vulnerability, they are required to only produce that vulnerability for the government. They do not publicly disclose it. Whereas we have a very public vulnerabilities process that is biased to be able to protect our citizens and be able to protect our industry. So we take just an example of just our very different approaches. But inside there, then what you should translate that to mean is China's creating a national zero-day factory. And there are consequences for us in now how we need to counter that. So I think your question was about the evolution. And I think what I owe back as one of the intelligence community leaders is being very clear-eyed on what is the threat and do that in a very balanced way that is also not overstating that threat. But where it continues to evolve, we should be communicating it to all of our foreign teammates, to all of our other interagency teammates and industry, but also we should be very clear in how we communicate it to the American people. And so I think that evolution has become very clear, and we've certainly tried to do that. In our annual threat assessments and each one of our hearings is to be able to very clearly talk about what does China, how they advanced, what areas they're focused on, and what are the implications for the United States.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for mentioning collaboration, not only with the private sector, but also with academia. I'm on the academia side, and so our students at the Bush School were working on a project to support the Senate Sergeant at Arms, to help look at the threat, not to the public through malign influence, but political influence to our senators and congressmen. So my question is, to help support my students working on this project, can you identify what some of the AI artificial intelligence augmented threats are to our politicians, and perhaps what the government or private sector supporting the government can do to help protect our legislators?
So it's a great question. And first, let me just do a little quick. One of the coolest parts of my job is the interaction we have with academia and with development programs. So I've been fortunate now. I'm meeting on a routine basis with college presidents. And I just find college presidents right now, the leadership that they do on a daily basis and the challenges that they face every day are really microcosms of our society. So I find them as leaders that are navigating very difficult waters. And they are also leaders every day that are engaged with the population of young students that are our future national security leaders. So how they interact, how they learn, what their goals are in abstract, really helpful advisors for understanding how we communicate, how we recruit, and then how we're going to continue to develop those leaders as they join. So I view them as critical allies in everything that we do. As we look at the AI threat today, certainly we are talking about this very clearly as it relates to the elections. And so the ODNI has put out papers on what we have seen, which countries have invested in AI, how they're using AI as it relates to the elections. But I think the key area for all of us is how do we leverage technology to not inhibit communication, but to be able to label communication. And clearly being able to identify what is AI generated would be an enormous step for all of us in how we think about it. For all that are looking at how do you detect, that's certainly an area the U.S. government has been very focused on leading into the elections, and an area that we've worked with both industry and academia across the U.S. government. I think those areas are ones that are going to continue to evolve rapidly, but I think the detection technology is the one that would be the most helpful for our legislators, because that would also help them understand the scale. Because we as the intelligence community are not going to be focused on communications inside the United States. We are going to be focused on foreign threats and being able to communicate very clearly what we know about those foreign threats. But we're not going to observe U.S. communication. That's against our laws, our values, and who we are. So that would be the area that I would focus on, is detection, so that we can make it more transparent.
Tim, it's Mark Montgomery over here. One quick question. The Secretary and the Chairman have not agreed to disaggregate the two hats of NSA and Cyber Command. What would it take what next steps are necessary to break, to be able to have Cyber Command stand on its own as an independent command?
So I think that's, Mark, thanks. One, thanks for your passion about cyber and the focus on our force. I think it's the wrong question. The wrong question is, how do we best posture our nation to be able to counter our adversaries? And so that's the approach that both the Secretary and the Chairman and the DNI took when they've examined this question. Congress asked the Department and DNI to look at it, and what their criterion was, what best postures our nation to be able to counter these threats. And I think what we're seeing now is an acceleration of the partnership, which is about what are the strengths of both organizations and how do we bring them to bear to counter adversary activity. And these are the things that I'm focused on, and how I talk to the Secretary, I talk to the DNI, and how we talk to Congress. Because inside there is really the strength of how we campaign. How do we generate insights and rapidly turn that into outcomes in defense, and then to deliver options to our policymakers? And as we've gained new authorities in U.S. Cyber Command, it's going to allow us to continue to accelerate. So the fact that we now have enhanced budget control, which means the department's budget in support of our cyber mission force is now given to U.S. Cyber Command to prioritize and execute. We got that authority 6 months into the last fiscal year, so we've had it for 6 months. And now I can make choices that really allow us to focus on the readiness of our force and the capabilities our force needs to be able to produce the outcomes that we want, all informed by the activities within the National Security Agency. And I think what we're going to find over time is there are going to also be some technologies that are going to drive us closer together, which is how we as a US government are going to be able to leverage and think about our overall high-performance computing, how we're going to be able to do that at scale, and where we leverage industry to be able to allow us to accelerate. So I think it's about outcomes, and what is the best organizational structure for our outcomes is the real question.
Okay, I think we have one more question over here. Adam, if we can get you a microphone very quickly.
Hi, sir. Thanks. Hello? Hi, sir. Adam Mariama, former NSAer, now with EverFox. But thank you very much for your comments. And I was wondering, we had a great conversation last night about the threat briefing every American needs. But when we think about the Chinese cyber threat, when we think about the conveniences that some Chinese companies like TikTok, like Temu, like Shine, make available to everyday Americans, how do we, as national security professionals, but as Americans, really communicate the degree of threat to our friends and family who may not be in this room, may not want to be in this room, may have fallen asleep in the corner of the room if they had been here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think some of this is going to play out over the next few months. So as the TikTok deadlines start to come to fruition, this is going to be a dialogue between the government and the American people, and of course, with all the interested parties around what will be the steps and likely the legal framework around the TikTok discussion. So I think we're going to have this conversation, and this one's going to be visceral because of the American use of TikTok at multi-generations. But we have been talking as much as we can about what are the risks and what are the risks to individuals and what are the risks to our nation. Our congressional leaders in a bipartisan way have taken action. And so I think that will now be incumbent on both the executive branch and certainly from an intelligence community perspective to re-articulate that threat that we had a very public discussion about last year, but as we get closer to it, I think we'll have to do that again. And then, of course, there's going to be a discussion that's going to be resolving around what are the next steps for the outcomes related to TikTok. And I think this is the use case. This is the one that allows us to have this conversation with the American people. And then what seems like a natural extension of that will be what is the dialogue that goes on with Congress as we talk about threats, because we are only going to talk about the threat with our congressional leaders. What are the areas that have them most concerned? And I think that's the part that we should inform. What does the threat look like? We should be able to communicate that threat to the best of our ability to the American people, and then allow both policymakers and our Congress to take whatever respective action that they believe is appropriate.
General, I want to thank you. I want to pose the final question, if I may. We have had a full day and an evening last night now of hearing about the threats facing the country. It's very easy to get depressed very quickly. I imagine with what you see every day and the briefing you get every morning, it's easy to feel that way as well. So I'd like to end on a happy note. I'd like to ask you how confident you are in NSA's abilities and capabilities to finally counter some of these threats, including the China threat, which you started out talking about. How confident are you in your capabilities?
So I'm incredibly confident. And one of the reasons is I think now what we're talking about, so I'll use the example again of Volt Typhoon. When NSA and our teammates disclosed Volt Typhoon last May, that was the beginning of then the series of actions that could now extend from that, which was how do you mobilize multiple nations to counter that threat? How does industry get best informed about that threat so they can take action? How can our other elements of the interagency work to be able to ensure that U.S. government could counter those activities? We've now seen all of them be successful. That started with an unclassified paper that was done by multiple nations, multiple agencies, and multiple members of industry. That's an exemplar of things that we could be doing again and again and again to make it more difficult. We've done over 70 public advisories that are around these threats. And in many cases, those advisories are at the keystroke level of what is an adversary doing, how are they doing it, and how can we counter it. And I think those are areas that we just want to continue to be able to bring more partners together, because I'm confident in our abilities to do that. But there's only so many things that we can do as an organization, but we can inform everyone of what we know. And I think that's going to be what you're going to see is going to be our inherent strength.
General Haugh, I want to thank you so much. Any closing thoughts?
No, thank you for having me.